You can be stuck in your progressiveness but not move anything. We have to recognize that when people are more concerned about their cordiality than they are concerned about the humanity of the people whose cordiality they are distancing themselves from, because they don't want to be seen as too close to these people they have otherized for whatever reasons. That is not anything but spinning wheels. You can be a progressive spinning in your progressivism and not move the needle toward justice, not move the needle toward liberation. And we see that now.
Judge Wendell Griffen, welcome. Welcome to Indiana Center for Middle East Peace in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Wendell Griffen is a Baptist pastor, a retired judge, and co-chair of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, a progressive African-American clergy conference dedicated to social justice here in the United States and around the globe. Again, Wendell, welcome.
It's good to be in Fort Wayne with you, Michael. Good to be part of what you're doing.
So, Wendell, let's get right to it. The Palestinian struggle for liberation has found great support within the African-American community. And we know that there's a number of churches, African-American churches, that are committed to Christian Zionism. And yet there's this mutual support between Black Lives Matter and the Palestinian struggle for liberation, both liberation struggles in each of their contexts. Talk to us about that mutual support.
That mutual support is real and is part of what I consider a global kind of support from nations in the global South with the Palestinian community. As you have mentioned, Nelson Mandela was strongly supportive of the Palestinian struggle from South Africa. The Palestinian struggle was part of the movement identified by churches in the United States, African-American churches in the United States, before 2012 and Michael Brown's murder in Ferguson. But when Michael Brown was murdered, it was text messages from Palestinians sent to people on the ground being tear gassed in Ferguson, Missouri, that told the protesters in Ferguson how to deal with tear gas, how to deal with snipers, how to deal with the issues they were facing. Because the Palestinians were dealing with these things 365, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. And that kind of global solidarity, before Michael Brown and after Michael Brown, is really part of what's going on now among people in the Proctor Conference and in other places.
You mentioned the support of Palestinians for those protesters who were protesting Michael Brown's murder. There's been great support throughout for Black Lives Matter from Palestinian Americans. Talk to us also about the African American support for Palestine.
The movement for Black Lives, as you know, has had as one of its principal tenets support for Palestinian liberation. And the integrity of the Palestinian struggle, its commitment, its perseverance in the face of tremendous pressures from within the Israeli government and pressures from around the world, from the United States, has been really remarkable, but it has been a source of inspiration for people who are concerned about liberation in the United States, Black liberation in the United States. So the solidarity between the two groups has been strong. The Palestinian community is very much aware of the kind of repressive things that happen between police and Black communities in this country. And Black people in this country are aware of the similarities between the struggles of Palestinian people and the repressive actions of the Israeli Defense Forces and the Israeli security apparatus in Israel and the occupied West Banks and Gaza. Last thing I'll say about this is many of us in Black churches are aware of the fact that many of our U.S. cities police forces or get their training
Yeah.
from Israeli defense forces and have partnership agreements with Israel. And so that kind of knowledge base has been a part of what makes us committed to the Palestinian struggle and sends, at times ties a bond between us.
You know, all liberation struggles are one struggle.
Yeah.
And so we're finding support for Palestine growing in this country for those who are working for LGBTQ plus rights, climate justice, refugee rights, indigenous peoples' rights. I mean, all liberation struggles are one struggle. You want to comment on that?
Well, that reminds me of what Dr. King said about we exist in an inescapable network of mutuality. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. There is something about repression that we who are in one space witnessing repression can identify with the repressive tendencies of empires and recognize the symptoms in our own environment. And so there's a sort of collegiality, I suppose I should say, that mutuality of interest, misery loves company, the shared notion of shared opposition to repression, shared opposition to injustice, and a shared love of liberation is global. I hear it from the Palestinian community. I saw it from the South African community. We see it from the Latino community in the southern hemisphere of the Americas. It is global, and it's encouraging. At the same time, I've got to say that we are recognizing around the world a rise in repression.
Yeah.
A rise in repression. And so we in this country are recognizing that the repression that we see in other countries mirrors the repression that we're experiencing in this country.
And yet there's something in the human spirit. I mean, Christians can talk about it in their own context, but other religious traditions, humanists even, right? There's something within the human spirit that yearns to be free.
All people have an innate desire for liberation, for the affirmation of their dignity, for the respect of their personhood, and the respect of their distinct heritage. And people groups may vary in language, in creed, in culture, but that shared sense of human dignity is universal. Somebody said children cry in the same language around the world. And tears have the same chemical content around the world. And so the sense of solidarity and community is innate. It is not political. It transcends politics. It transcends nationalities. It transcends boundaries. It transcends ideologies. It is universal. And it is part of what makes us a universal community and part of what makes any person's suffering a pain to every person who cares about dignity.
Episcopal Bishop Marilyn Buddy this week attracted a lot of attention for her gentle yet very pointed and powerful words to the president in her sermon at the Washington National Cathedral. And I know it moved you very much. They moved you very much. Just say a word about that.
I thought of what she said. I viewed her homily and I thought the right words, the right way, the right time, and spoken to the right person. The way that Bishop Buddy spoke about unity, affirming human dignity, affirming respect for the human integrity of all persons and each person, and respect and a need for humility, was a message that every person can identify with, and that our society, like every other society, can't get too much of. She said it at the right time, because at the beginning of President Trump's second term in office, he needs to know that the unity of our people is his responsibility to lead. And he needs to know that's a passion that will not be silenced. He needs to know that humility is necessary. Hubris has been as you know, Michael, has been the undoing of many leaders, not just political leaders, but leaders in all kinds of walks of life. And finally, she said it the right way. It was direct, it was prophetic, but it was not preacherly. It was the preacher, pastor, the bishop, but she was not using a shouting voice. She was using a voice that beseeched the president and all of us to listen, to weigh her words, and to weigh our conducts, because as she said, it is not what we say as we pray, but the relationship between what we say and what we do. And at the beginning of this tenure in President Trump's presidency, that reminder was very important. I was also impressed by the fact that despite how well she said and how appropriate it was, people went out of their way in some places to find fault with it simply because she said it.
Yeah. Showed the power of it and the truth of it.
Oh, exactly. It was, who can quarrel about unity? Who can quarrel about humility? Who can quarrel about dignity? But the fact that she said it to the president brought a lot of people out of their ceremonial dignity and brought them into their real personalities. They really reared up. And I think that's important for us to remark upon. Because you see, as you know, when truth is spoken, it can be spoken with a soft voice and still carry a strong impact.
Yeah.
Ouch was heard and felt.
You've referenced South Africa a couple times so far. South Africa leads the world, along with Ireland, leads the world in support for Palestine. Advocacy, financially, court cases, in a number of ways. Talk about this bond that South Africans feel with their Palestinian sisters and brothers.
I mentioned Nelson Mandela's relationship to the Palestinians and the fact that when he went to Palestine, he said, until Palestinians are free, none of us are free. Mandela said that. Until Palestinians are free, none of us are free. This is someone who had spent 3 decades in prison fighting the apartheid regime in South Africa. This is someone who had come from prison and later became leader of South Africa. This is someone who was working to make the liberation movement in South Africa real, but he also recognized that as far as South Africa had gotten, South Africa would never be free as long as Palestinians were not free. And that was a reminder to not only South Africans, it was a reminder to the rest of us. Black liberation movements in this country can say with truth, as long as there is no freedom for Palestinians, there is no freedom for Philadelphians or Los Angelenos or folks from Little Rock, or folks from Fort Wayne, or folks from Atlanta, because, as King said, we are all caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality.
I know you've given a lot of thought to this, and it's based in King, right? The racist, militarist, capitalist state, King's giant triplets, right, underlie the Trump administration, but frankly, previous administrations too, Democrat and Republican.
The U.S. empire.
But we can see it though we can see it clearly with the current administration, as well as Israel's apartheid, ethnic cleansing, genocide. It's a huge topic. Talk about that demonic interrelationship.
As you mentioned, Dr. King, in 1967, April 4, 1967, and
1 year.
1 year to the day before he was murdered in Memphis, he spoke what I consider his best speech, and the one that is least often quoted, but most pertinent to our situation, titled Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence, because he pivoted after he called for the U.S. to end its military involvement in Southeast Asia and the war in Vietnam. He pivoted and said, we have to face the fact that the United States appears to be on the wrong side of what he called a world revolution. And so King called for a radical revolution of values, his words, that was necessary, in his opinion, in order to deal with the giant triplets: racism, capitalism, and militarism. I agree with you, Michael. We have not corralled those triplets. They have bred and multiplied. They are now octuplets: racism, capitalism, militarism, imperialism, sexism. We have the issue of xenophobia. We have the issue of technocentrism, which is not only the technical situations involving surveillance around the world, but also the influence of technology that makes us feel less respectful of each other at the time we have the information age. And finally, we have the issue of classism, which is a separate thing from capitalism, because capitalism is love of wealth, love of property. Classism is the love of distance. And so we have the highest income gap in the United States in recent years, and the income gap is widening and deepening. The Trump administration doesn't seem to be interested in doing anything about it, and that is one of the real problems we have, because you cannot say MAGA and make that statement without drawing a response. Every empire has aspired toward greatness, including hideous empires. The question is not whether an empire is great or any nation is great. The question is whether it's good.
You know, maybe one of the reasons why we, on the left, both hate and fear the Trump administration is that it exposes our own complicity in the empire. You know, it brings it all out into the light. I mean, it didn't begin with him, right?
No,
it didn't begin with Trump.
No.
I mean, it was Biden, it was with Obama, it was with, go back to our founders, right? The racism and sexism and et cetera, and even Christian nationalism that's built into some of our founder statements. So, I mean, it's part of the empire, and it exposes our own complicity.
We have, as you mentioned, always, from the inception of this nation, had a contaminated notion of what it means to be good. We believe that goodness was freedom, but only for some people, only for white men. Only for white men were property. Remember, it was only propertied white men who were supposed to be free. And then later, only white men and formerly enslaved black men, but only those formerly enslaved black men who do not challenge the privileges of white men. And many years later, the notion of women was included. But now we see that attacks are being made about the very notion of women having the integrity over their own bodies, over the notion of people who have sexual identity or gender orientation differences that differ from the heterosexual binary. How dare they aspire to be treated as equal? This is always a challenge for an empire. But we have to use the F word in this time. Fascism has made this, in the age of Trump now, a reality that we have to wrestle with. We don't play enough with that fascism word. We don't use it enough. Christian nationalism has always been part of the undercurrent of the society, but never has fascism been embraced by all three branches of government, from the federal level down to the local levels, and we're seeing that now. And the final thing I'll say on that point is we are seeing it now being embraced by the religious community that calls itself by the name of Jesus. The same way that it was seen in Germany 100 years ago almost, as the Third Reich came to power. I will remind people that the Third Reich was elected, and everything that Hitler did was, quote, legal.
Yeah. You've been in the process of working on a book for a couple of decades now, with at least part of the title, right? The Hateful Faithful and the Threat to Democracy. Talk to us about that.
In 2003, during the George W. Bush first term, it became clear to me that there was a confluence of factors. Hateful belief surrounding religion, hateful belief concerning the use of financial capital, what I call neo-fundamental capitalism, and hateful political ideology, authoritarianism. Hateful faith in those three areas has been rising, and it is working its way, well, it has worked its way from the subterranean level and is now not only above ground, it is not only ascendant, it is triumphant. It is triumphant. And it is a threat to democracy and to liberation and to justice, not only in this country. It is a threat around the world. It's what Alan Busek says is responsible for global apartheid. And I think that we have to begin to think about that as followers of Jesus, that we can't be in silos. We can't ghettoize our notion of liberation, because we are dealing, like a pandemic, with a global threat to human dignity, liberation, and justice.
You know, we in the progressive churches and liberals politically who wouldn't identify as religious, Christian nationalists, those on the religious right, they're sort of easy to identify. They're low-hanging fruit and easy pickings for us in the so-called progressive churches to to vilify in sermons and teaching and all the rest. But the so-called progressive churches are in bed with empire too. Their quietude, their excuse for inaction on Palestine because of so-called interfaith dialogue, their civility in the face of genocide, their timidity to confront evil when they see it. Say a word about these so-called progressive churches and their being in bed with the empire.
The future of the so-called progressive movement may very well have been summed up in 1963 by Martin Luther King Jr. when he wrote his letter from Birmingham jail. And he, as you may recall, he was pointed in his challenge to what he called white moderates, who we would call progressives now, because he noticed that they were always more concerned about time and decorum than about the realities of suffering that people were experiencing. And I like to remind people that all motion is not movement. A stuck car spinning doesn't move, even though it is in motion. And you can be stuck in your progressiveness but not move anything. We have to recognize that when people are more concerned about their cordiality than they are concerned about the humanity of the people whose cordiality they are distancing themselves from, because they don't want to be seen as too close to these people who they have otherized for whatever reasons. That is not anything but spinning wheels. You can be a progressive spinning in your progressivism and not move the needle toward justice, not move the needle toward liberation. And we see that now. People who don't want to be identified for Palestinian liberation because they're afraid they're going to offend somebody who is concerned about Israel. And they are concerned that somebody who may be concerned about Israel may view them in a certain kind of way, but they're not concerned about the impact of their timidity on Palestinians whose lives, whose property, whose futures are being threatened. So that false sense of balance, and it is a false sense of balance, is a real cause for concern for all of us, I think.
Talk to us. Well, let me ask it this way. It's clear, right, that two of the reasons that Kamala Harris lost this recent election were because of racism and misogyny.
Yeah.
There is no way a woman or a woman of color is going to be elected in this country because of the inherent racism and misogyny of the general population, specifically white men and white women.
Yeah.
You can say a word about that if you'd like, but I also want you to comment on the role that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's complicity and absolutist support, criminal support for Israel's genocide in Gaza and against the Palestinian people played in Harris's election loss.
I think, and I'll start with the last part first. I think that the United States had a chance to begin to repent for over 75 years of complicity in Israeli aggression toward Palestinians. During the Joe Biden era, not Biden, not alone, but every president since Harry Truman has invested in Israeli oppression against Palestinians, land theft, ethnic cleansing. The apartheid regime didn't begin in 2000 or 2020 or 2022. It began in 1948 and has been embraced ever since. The problem during the last election is that Joe Biden vociferously proclaimed himself a Zionist, hugged Benjamin Netanyahu publicly, then flew back to Washington, and his administration vetoed a ceasefire resolution when we were screaming for a ceasefire. Black clergy took out a full-page ad in the New York Times calling for a ceasefire. Kamala Harris was too timid to speak about that before Joe Biden withdrew. And when Joe Biden withdrew, she refused to be boldly in support of ceasefire or speak about Palestinian liberation. And the refusal to allow Palestinian American delegates to the Democratic National Convention to even have 5 minutes to make a plea to the nation at the convention was inexcusable. And it was not ignored by Palestinian Americans around the country, as well as others in solidarity with them. Palestinian Americans were not the only ones. That's the first thing. That was inexcusable. And there are people, myself included, who said during the time, September and August of 2024, this may well seal Kamala Harris's defeat. It wasn't the only thing, because misogyny and racism also factored in. I don't believe that Donald Trump got elected because of the price of eggs. Because Kamala Harris wasn't saying, I like the price of eggs so high. Kamala Harris wasn't saying, I believe that we should have the price of eggs go up. Kamala Harris was not saying, I don't care about this. As a matter of fact, she was saying we should make home ownership easier to do. And so she was dealing with this. It was a black woman with South Asian heritage, whose name was intentionally mispronounced. Her first name was intentionally mispronounced, and whose identity, her decency, her intellect were questioned because she was not white and she was not male. And that is a damning indictment on the United States in 2025. We're beginning the second quarter century of the 21st century. And that is something that no one should forget. The United States remains a racist, Martin King said it, a racist society, a sexist society, despite our wonderful attributes.
You're the co-chair of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. So I want you to talk about the conference and some of what you do, but I also want you to talk about Samuel DeWitt Proctor himself. He mentored many of the civil rights leaders who had came to renown, who we have known and respected. But Samuel DeWitt Proctor, like I say, mentored many of them, and they stand on his shoulders. And so talk to us about Proctor, but also about the Proctor Conference.
Thank you. I'm blessed to be co-chair with Bishop Leah Daughtry of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. And it is named after Samuel DeWitt Proctor, who was a wonderful educator, theologian, pastor. Samuel DeWitt Proctor from Virginia, president of North Carolina A&T, an HBCU. When he was president of North Carolina A&T, he had a student body president named Jesse Jackson. He went on to become dean of Virginia Union School of Theology in Richmond, Virginia. When he was dean of Virginia Union, he had a seminary student named Jeremiah A. Wright Jr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor mentored Iva Elaine Carruthers during her doctor ministry work. And Samuel DeWitt Proctor
And Iva Carruthers is now
the General Secretary of Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. Thank you. And Samuel DeWitt Proctor got his PhD in moral theology at Boston University ahead of Martin Luther King Jr., who came after him. And Proctor was on campus when King was coming on campus, and Proctor and King engaged in, across King's lifetime, conversations and interactions. Proctor was the pastor of Palestinian Church in Harlem, succeeding Adam Clayton Powell Jr. And so Proctor has all of these connections with the Black faith community, with the prophetic faith community, with the civil rights leadership community. And he had the wonderful ability, for all of his erudition. He was a wonderful scholar, a great human soul. He had the ability to make every person recognize that they were a child of God with innate dignity. And that was his signal blessing. To have sat in his presence, to have heard him talk, has been a blessing for everyone who did it. And the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference carries on his work by affirming a serious, humble, dedicated approach to theology in the religion of Jesus, understanding that our piety cannot be disconnected from our praxis, that our theology cannot be disconnected from our testimony, that our words cannot be connected from our ways. And those things have to work together. Proctor made it plain, as Dr. G. Alfred Smith Sr. says of Allen Temple Baptist Church in Oakland. And Proctor made it plain and made it incumbent on all of us who would serve as followers of Jesus, as clergy and lay leaders, because the Proctor Conference is not only clergy, but also lay leaders. It's activists, it's artists. And so we're looking forward to the Proctor Conference next month in Little Rock. It's an annual event, but it's more than an event. Year in and year out, throughout the year, the Proctor Conference does things. For instance, after October 3rd, 2023, the Proctor Conference had a multi-week series online on being Black and Christian in a time of war, where theologians, men and women from various traditions, Church of God in Christ, African Methodist Episcopal, American Methodist Episcopal Zion, Baptist, these voices from across the Black religious context, also from across the global context. Alan Buzek was there. We had folks from the Caribbean there. In line with this, we had folks from Great Britain there, Anthony Reddy. So we had this conversation. The Proctor Conference does that because that's how big and deep and wide Samuel Proctor's sense of the witness of our faith was. He was in Africa with the Peace Corps and the Johnson administration. So he had a very real sense that what we talk about in this stuff is global. Somebody said all politics is local, but all localities have global implications.
Yeah. Finally, in the aftermath of genocide, in many places of war and violence around the globe, the rise of fascist regimes around the globe, and the fears and anxieties with this new administration in our country, the rising fascism in our country, and its public face, its public voice. In the midst of all that, what gives you hope?
I used to ask myself that question, and Jeremiah Wright answered it for me. Because Jeremiah Wright was asked that question at a Proctor Conference during breakout group that he led. And this was after Jeremiah had his stroke. He was in a wheelchair and his voice was not as strong as it once was. He says the devil struck my left side, but God left me in my right mind. And Jeremiah Wright said, what gives me hope are the young people. And I thought about that. It's the young people. It's the young activists, the young Jewish activists and Jewish voices of peace who are calling for the liberation of Palestine and on their campuses from high schools, not just college campuses, but high schools and college campuses. The young black activists, the young LGBTQ activists, the young white rural activists, the young white male activists, the young people are the sign of hope. Farmers know that no matter how bad your last crop boy is, as long as you have seed corn, you can farm. And farmers leave every season, whether it's drought or it's flood or it's pesticides, mindful of protecting the seed corn. I think about how the young people are doing, their activism, their tenacity, their refusal to back down, even in the face of repression. And they are experiencing serious repression too. And that gives me hope. And I tell the young people, I'm on my descent. I've been here a minute. They're on their ascent. My job as I descend is to burn as much of the stuff out of the atmosphere that would interfere with their ascendancy. Together, as my generation goes down, their generation comes up, it's hopeful to see them working and to see our paths cross. That gives me great hope.
Judge, Pastor Wendell Griffen, thank you.
Michael, it's so good to be with you. Thank you for your work and your witness. Indiana Center for Middle East Peace does the good work, the good way, and you are a great example. I look forward to our continued work together.
Thanks, Wendell.